So you should get a little notification saying that it's recording. Brilliant. So again, welcome everyone. I'm pleased to introduce Bernadine, who's going to talk about her book, and I'll invite her to share her screen and get started. She's going to do a quick talk and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end.
All right, there we go. So hopefully you guys can see that. All good? Hopefully. Okay.
Yep, definitely.
Great. All right, so we're all good to go. Okay, so thank you very much for joining me today and for coming along to this very popular seminar. Thank you, Emily, for inviting me as well. Today, I'm going to give you a hopefully very quick rundown of my recently published book called Elections and TV News in South Africa, Desperately Seeking Depth, which is right there on the screen. Before we get to the good stuff, which is some comments or questions or some discussion, anything that you want to say at the end. So when I was going through some images to try and populate these slides, I was trying to find something that really symbolized South Africa for me. And I found this image, and I think it's quite interesting. I wonder what you guys think of it. So you can see the South African flag there, but there's also some lights. Now, I wonder what you think that those might be. Do you think that it's stars, or do you think that it's embers from a fire? So we could look at South Africa either rising to the heavens, like this Africa rising trope, or it could be that it's fire, and those are flames and embers. So based on what I'm going to talk to you about today, I wonder what you think it symbolizes. All right, so I want to start with a quote, if I can do this. There we go, from Professor Jane Duncan in 2009. And I think it's really important because it shows not only the critical function of a free press in a democracy, but also the importance of visual representation in a democracy. Because censorship is a constant problem, not only in South Africa, but also globally with the free press. And it's really the heart of this book. Because without knowing what your society looks like, you cannot understand what is happening within your society. So this is really the heart of the book, and it's also the heart of the talk that I want to give today. So what does this book do? Well, it does two things. Firstly, it advocates for taking television news seriously, both in terms of understanding how it works and also systematically analyzing it as a medium. The second thing this book does is it tries to tell the story of South African democracy. It's a compilation to track 25 years of journalistic practice, but also events within the society. So let's have a look at the first one now. The primary aim of this book is to advocate for a deeper understanding of how television news works. There are not many more impactful moments than watching a historic event unravel, or indeed unfold, live on air. TV news has the liveness, the immediacy, the visualness that press and radio simply cannot reproduce. So the method that I used in terms of analyzing TV news broadcasts stems from my PhD, and I looked at the visuals alongside the audio within the context of journalistic practice. And obviously, the journalistic practice changed over 25 years, so that is a large comment within the book. And it also offers journalists a point of departure to perhaps reconsider their own practice, be a bit more reflexive, and also hold news frames to account that tend to strangle the profession. But what is TV news in itself? And this is something that I deliberate on in the book quite a bit. So we here today, sitting in front of me, listening to me talk, probably don't watch TV news on a TV set like that. We might watch it on YouTube, or we might watch it through the BBC iPlayer, something like that. It's very unlikely that we use a TV set to actually watch the news. But this is a westernized, globalized, global north idea of what TV news is. In rural South Africa, it's very likely that people would watch TV news on a set like that. Maybe it's a little bit more modern now, but you get the point. So TV news in terms of the book and also the chat today means video news, video on demand, streaming, moving image news, anything like that. It's what we used to call packages or broadcasts. It doesn't really matter where you get it from. It's the visualness that I was interested in. All right, so that's the first aim of the book. The second aim is to try and tell the story of South Africa's democracy over the last 25 years. Usually academic books on South Africa and the elections tend to focus either on one year, so you would have 1994 or 2014, and they would exist separately. What I wanted to do was try and compile all 25 years together and tell a story of the events. And chronology is really important in this book. So as you open it, a timeline confronts you. And it tracks the very beginnings of South African politics in 1910, all the way through to the new dawn of Ramaphosa's presidency that we currently find ourselves in. And I think it's really important that the book is framed like this, because some of the chapters tend to jump around a little bit between eras and events and presidencies. So it's useful to have that as a point of reference as you open the book. So, all right, those are the two things that this book tries to do. But today I want to speak a little bit about some key moments that weave itself through the book. And there are 4 of them, ranging from how the media creates kings or politicians or presidents, and how elections are visualized on the news. All right, so those are the 4 things that I want to speak about today. Let's have a look at the first one, kingmakers of the 20th century. So throughout the last couple of decades, the media are recognized kingmakers of politicians. So if you had the support of the media, you had the support of the people. And if you pleased the media, you won more space and time on the news. And that would probably mean more votes because you were in the public's mind more often. And politicians who don't work within the hype machine inevitably lag behind. And we saw this in crystal clarity in the Trump cabinet with Bernie Sanders, maybe a little bit with Hillary Clinton, that kind of thing. And this is a global political journalism concept, this idea of kingmakers. But it also reflects itself in South African media and news as well. And I speak in chapters 1 and 5, particularly about theories and concepts, things like the fifth estate, where journalism is captured by big business, mediatization, where politicians in particular are hyper aware of the news cycle and news values in every part of their lives. And also more recently, and probably more concerningly, is the intersection between PR companies, big data, and politics. So I speak about those specifically in chapters 1 and 5. And as I said, these are global issues, but they also affect South African journalism. And South Africa's news media has always had a difficult and tumultuous relationship with the ruling government. During the apartheid days, the National Party harassed, hounded, and arrested any journalist perceived to be independent. So investigative journalism has had a really hard path to blaze in the country, and it still does. And this deteriorating relationship damages democracy. And I want to speak a bit about that today. So since the inception of broadcast media in the 1930s, South Africa's media has been owned, governed, influenced, and funded by party political leaders. So, for example, D.F. Malan was the leader of the first apartheid regime, and he also chaired the first South African Broadcasting Corporation board. So the SABC is our national broadcaster, and it was mirrored on the BBC. In the 1940s, the National Party, these white guys here, strove for Afrikaner protection and an ideal Afrikaner state. They had the support of the strong Afrikaner press, and they were fully behind the National Party when it won the election in 1948, thus beginning the first Afrikaner apartheid regime. After that, the National Party expected the press, as you would, to fully support them. But then the press turned into a watchdog. They started to pick holes in the apartheid regime. They started to hold the National Party to account for what they were doing. And the National Party couldn't fathom why the press suddenly turned against them. So what does a paranoid, autocratic political party do when faced with watchdogism? They clamped down on journalists with an iron fist. news was heavily censored, either directly or through a system of self-censorship, where journalists wrote what they thought editors and the government wanted to hear. Some journalists, like the very young Max du Preez here, demanded press freedom, and they were hounded, harangued, and policed by the apartheid Secret Service throughout the 70s and 80s. One of the very first news broadcasts was the Sharpeville massacre, and it was reported on in a very sober and unemotional way so as not to create unnecessary excitement and unrest. And this was to become a template for apartheid-era programming. Journalists attempted to get the full picture, but the SABC editorial policy relied on police reports rather than investigative journalism. So these police reports showed that everything was under control and the police were bringers of law and order. Of course, we know that things were quite different. So TV news was finally introduced in South Africa quite late in 1976, after the National Party had called it that evil black box for decades. But it was introduced not because of the free speech advocates or any of the anti-apartheid activists. It was introduced because the National Party was very arrogant. They thought that their God-given right to rule was solid. So they allowed television news in, they allowed television programming in, because they thought they had such an iron grip on the public sphere. And they did have a solid leak-proof grip. They tightly controlled and carefully crafted narratives to avoid breaking the spell of the apartheid regime. Government narratives were uncritically repeated by the media. That created a hegemony, an unquestioned reality amongst most South Africans. And in this way, overseas audiences like yourself probably saw more about the protest action and the unrest that South Africans like me, living just a few kilometers away, actually saw. And this was because the National Party's control of news narratives was so stringent. So when I was just 3 years old in the 1980s, I'm dating myself here, we lived on the outskirts of a new housing estate in Rudebolt in Johannesburg. And it was just across the veld from Katlehong and Thokoza townships. It was, of course, a white housing development, and we were kept apart not only through news narratives and the media, but also through geography. Every so often, we heard bangs and pops and sounds like cars backfiring, and there was the occasional scream and shout. And this let us know that maybe everything wasn't all right across the road, across the veld. We lived not more than 5 kilometers away from some of the bloodiest battles between the ANC, the IFP, and Third Force factions, but we hardly even realized it. But how could this happen? How could South Africans not know what was happening right under their noses? The answer lies in control of popular media from our early understanding of the information wars. The power of popular media and the danger of a government with an iron grip cannot be understated. By the way, thank you to Greg Marinovich for these emotional pictures. So South African news at the time had devolved into something called sunshine journalism, where it promoted a good news narrative. The government banned images of protest action and dissent, and this led to a skewed image of repression in South Africa. Now, if you know anything about the current ANC agenda, the good story to tell agenda, you can see that there are correlations between the apartheid era news and their current agenda. And this is why I want you to understand the background to media in South Africa and why it is so important right now. So pre-democracy, the ANC had unrivaled support in the English press, both local and international. The negotiated settlement between the ANC, the IFP, and the National Party fitted really nicely and neatly into neoliberal news narratives, which drove political journalism at the time. So here you can see some examples of positive, but quite binarized examples from the US and the UK. There's the New York Times, 1986, The Guardian, 1989, an anti-apartheid newsletter. All of these promoted the ANC in quite a good light. Once in power, however, The new ANC government had to very quickly come to terms with being on the wrong side of the news media, both in South Africa and internationally. Editors and journalists that had once been part of the Liberation Alliance were now suddenly holding the party and the government to account, and there was vigorous political debate at the center. To say that the party was not impressed with the criticism is putting it lightly. So just as the National Party in 1948 clamped down on counter-narratives, so too did an increasingly paranoid ANC turn against the free press. Gradually at first, and then very, very quickly. Mbeki bristled against journalists when they came with mediatised questions. Zuma's state capture era moved independent journalism further into the corner. Even under Ramaphosa's new dawn, there are still flames to be doused. But why does the ANC have such animosity to the free press? Have they not learnt the lessons of the past and realized that functioning democracy relies on a free and liberal press? So the next thing I want to talk about is something called the liberation narrative. I've written a whole chapter about this, but it's actually the thread that goes throughout the book. And this is arguably one of the most concerning aspects of modern democracy and media in South Africa. So South Africa has had 5 presidents. You probably know 2 of these, maybe 3. Each has had an interesting relationship with the press. Each controlled narratives about the party, both within and also without. I titled this chapter, "The ANC Has No Clothes," after a German fairy tale, The Emperor Has No Clothes, right? But this is the fairy tale that the ANC tells about itself and that others then replicate in order to form an unquestioned truth that is ultimately very damaging to democracy. To this day, the ANC continues to present itself as the only legitimate liberation movement. It is not a united or allied movement. There were only fellow travelers. The ANC claims legitimacy as the only force against apartheid. The fellow travelers, as they call it, are the Pan-African Congress, the United Democratic Front, the South African Communist Party, and the Black Sash, to name just a few. But by discrediting all other anti-apartheid activist groups and movements has resulted in what Graham calls a self-centered heroic narrative. This narrative distorts the historical picture of plural movements and instead creates a binary of us versus them. Now, the ANC has been pretty successful at controlling the narratives and the histories. It tends to squash dissent in the media. It imposes libel or insult judgments against political cartoonists. It calls journalists anti-democracy or anti-majoritarian or simply just racist. This is how the ANC maintains hegemony as the sole liberator of South Africa. The election campaign rhetoric also centers on the ANC as sole liberator. So they have slogans like "a better life for all" and "fighting for change" that speaks back to this revolutionary history. But unfortunately, the slow pace of change, poor levels of service service delivery, I suppose security as well, and a continued inequality face the ANC with every passing election. So the party is forced to turn to history as a justification for its retention of power rather than its record in office. And it makes broad appeals that it and no other is the face of the anti-apartheid struggle. But South Africa is one of the most unequal societies in the world, and it's only gotten worse since 2006. 34% of South Africans live in townships with no amenities, no lights, no sanitation, very little running water. The ANC has tried to get on top of these living conditions since 1994, but the population has just exploded, and with them, townships. Residents are frustrated, they're angry, and they're fed up. So what does the ANC do when faced with dissent? It emulates the National Party from 1948, probably unwittingly. The ANC employed party loyalists to populate mainstream media boards to cut out this rebellion from news media. It sends in the military to stamp out protest action. It denies alternative narratives, and it ceases to speak to journalists. This guy here is Claudie Motsoeneng. He was the chief operating officer of the SABC, and he was an ANC stalwart. In June 2016, he declared that there would be no more news of protest action where property was damaged, particularly no news images. He said it was to prevent copycat protests. So if people saw property being damaged, they would be encouraged to do the same thing. So he banned all news images of protest action where property was damaged. In a blatant misunderstanding of media effects theory, he fell into the old shoes of the National Party, and he effectively made sunshine journalism news policy. If news is censored at election time, the voting populace does not get a full and accurate and critical perspective of the political landscape. This creates an ever-increasing gap between citizens and politicians, because citizens end up seeing the good news rather than the full news. And this is one of the biggest concerns for media scholars in the country. I argue that this was because of the roots of the ANC's attempt to control the dominant narratives about and within the party. And I call this the liberation narrative. The thing is, this liberation narrative is not necessarily an outright falsehood. It's an acceptable version of the history that the ANC wants to tell. It obliterates smaller opposition movements and their role in history. So South Africa's identity is an amalgamation of difference, but the ANC's appropriation of their own struggle history is not an amalgamation, but it is a devouring of opposing identities. The unquestioned retelling of this liberation narrative means that the ANC is in danger of becoming a synecdoche for the entire anti-apartheid and anti-colonialist struggle. It leaves out the many facets of resistance, and it essentially squashes 300 years of opposition into one simple stereotype. And the more that this is retold, the more that we forget the actual history. And this has terrible implications for democracy. Remember what I said, that a society that cannot fully see themselves cannot fully deliberate on the issues that surround them. I didn't say that, it was Professor Jane Duncan. But this is exactly what I found when I analysed the news broadcasts. Journalists uncritically and probably unwittingly mimic government voices when representing the elections. Here are some examples from the later years, from 2009 all the way up to 2019. We have the BBC, the CNN, Sky News, Reuters, and CBS mimicking this liberation narrative that the ANC and no other is responsible for liberating the country. Right at the bottom, we have Deborah Patter, who's actually a South African journalist now working for CBS. She says that, remember, this is the party of Nelson Mandela that liberated this country. So interestingly, South African channels don't necessarily repeat this in as many words, but they don't really say anything about anything. They tend to frame authorities in control of the violence. They promote the democratic process. They avoid scandals like Nkandla. The protests are framed as something to be controlled. And in this way, neither local nor international channels critique the ANC as fully as they should, given fourth estate journalistic ideals. And instead, it is up to the non-mainstream media to do this. Amandla TV in 2009, Vice News, and Politically Aware depicted far more citizen voices than mainstream traditional news media. Non-mainstream media interviewed citizens about housing and about unemployment. They asked for their opinions about the new political parties like COPE, EFF, and Good. Vice News specifically gives me such heart. It was amazing. The journalist here made ANC spokesperson Jesse Duarte visibly uncomfortable when asking direct questions about land distribution, and he consistently refused to back down. No other journalist received that kind of access or broadcast that kind of interrogation. It was amazing. It's on YouTube. I recommend that you go and see it. This style of broadcast gives me hope. We can see that there is creative literary journalism, and it can be successfully combined with fourth estate watchdogism. So non-mainstream media sought the why far more often than mainstream channels, which appeared quite puzzled as to why the ANC continued to be victorious at the polls. Without neoliberal news values constraining them and no limitation on time or story type, the non-mainstream news channels were free to cover grassroots voices without the demand for authority sources. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is how the visuals represented the election. So this is the visual analysis moments in my book, which are the last couple of chapters. And I want to speak about how violence was represented during the elections in particular. Now, the word and the term violence came to signify different things over the years. In 1994, here are some screenshots from the 1994 broadcasts. Violence meant actual bloody violence. So injured people where lives were at risk. The violence here was a real risk to bodily harm or fighting between factions. Later, however, violence could mean, like the Marikana massacre, which was referenced by the BBC and CNN in 2014, but more frequently, violence came to mean community protest action, where people burnt trash, or they blocked roads, or they destroyed the voting stations. That's what violence came to mean. But both carried equal weight in what violence actually meant. So when you hear in later elections that the election day was marred by violence, it's more likely to mean community protest action rather than actual factional fighting and death. So the second example of how elections were represented in terms of the visuals was the involvement of the police and the military. Military in South Africa are often framed as bringers of law and order. And there was very little critique throughout the last couple of decades from South African or from global international channels. So for example, here are some screenshots from 2014 and also 1994. And you can see that by or through mercy or through might, the military and the police were signified as in control of the election. There were very few broadcasts where we saw actual police action, where they were shooting their guns or chasing protesters or anything like that. The police and the military were often signified as being in control and also in maintenance mode, just standing around and watching what was going on, although we do know that police action did happen. So the police were portrayed as calm. They were positioned between us, the viewers, and them, which were the voters and the protesters, and they were in maintenance mode. On that note, how the police were positioned between us and the voters and South Africans, viewers in general were kept apart from the South African populace, either through their experience of poverty or through protest action. There were a lot of long shots. So protests in the township were framed in long shots. The close-ups tended to be burning rubble or debris. And critically, there were a lack of citizen voices. And all of these things tended to keep the experience of ordinary South Africans at arm's length from the viewer. Now, getting close to protests in moments of crisis is dangerous, of course, but the lack of protester voices and the investigation into reasons and consequences of election violence degrades deliberative information into just fly-on-the-wall stories. Journalists seem to be there to merely show intense visuals rather than to explain, explore, and summarize. And keeping the events at arm's length plays into the neoliberal news values that demand dichotomies in order to sell stories. All right, so I suggest 3 conclusions to all of this, and you can read this in the last chapter. The first one is that reports that focus too much on mediatization hamper clear and concise communication. And this happened specifically from international journalists. Secondly, local journalists tended to be hesitant to critique authorities or to show controversial news frames. They seemed restrained by the intensified political involvement over the years. International journalists, however, went too far the other way, and they fixated on dramatic and bewildering footage. And finally, all mainstream news channels disengaged with politician and citizen voices over the years, until finally these were replaced with pundits. It was the non-mainstream news that did the heavy lifting in later years. They represented the view from the ground through citizen experiences rather than from the authorities. So, for example, here in 1994, we are treated to in-depth interviews with political party representatives. This never really happened again, thanks to the liberation narrative. But the voting populace were often nameless, faceless, and unvoiced. Later, the same kind of thing happens. We hear a lot from the Born Frees in 2009 and 2014, and the Black Diamonds in 2004. But otherwise, the voting populace is homogenous, they're scary, and they're kept at a distance from us, the viewers. It seems that voices are determined by news values rather than from listening to the ground. So what is a journalist to do? I don't want to sound too much like Debbie Downer here. The book does end on some heartening examples of excellent journalism over the years, and it has suggestions from a promising approach that recommends emotion-driven journalism. And this is called constructive journalism. This approach revisits the profession's key tenets of societal good, information-based communication, and citizen-focused and solution-oriented stories. It's true, there is a push towards mediatized political journalism, and that tended to dominate the coverage. But some masterful examples where journalists created magic and responded to society's most pressing needs with compassion and care are outstanding. Constructive journalism focuses on community, society, Ubuntu, and people-oriented stories. If you take anything away from this book, let it be this. Let us revisit the tenets of journalism and create a world where societies can see themselves and deliberate on their most pressing needs, where we can seek the depth to stories rather than just rely on razzmatazz to sell them. All right, there we go. That's it. Thank you for listening and for sticking with me. If you have any questions or anything you'd like to say, I'm all ears right now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. There was so much for us to dig into there. Brilliant. So does anyone want to kick us off with a question or comment? I'm assuming this is clapping and not indications of having questions. Okay, I'll start then with basically just a plea for more information. I just wonder if you could say a little bit more about, you know, the value really of doing this historical look. I mean, I've got lots to say about it. I'm a bit biased, having done a historical look at elections myself, but you know, it reveals so much. I just wondered if you could kind of basically just talk us through, you know, the changes and why you wanted to kind of track them in this way.
It's a really good question, actually. There's a lot in it as well. Well, when I was doing my PhD, I found, actually they're behind me here, something called a compendium of elections. So usually you would find 1994, and you would have a look at the voting turnout, the media coverage, the elections, and the events. And then you would have 1999, the voting turnout, the media, that kind of thing, right? And you would have, like, each year would be dedicated. There was nothing that kind of brought everything together. There are a couple that looked at the Mbeki years or the Zuma years, but there was nothing that really focused on media and the coverage and how that changed over 25 years. So that's something that I wanted to try and do with this book. But of course, if you want to look at how the media represented democracy, you have to look at what happened in the democracy. So that's why the book opens with the story of South African democracy over 25 years, and then goes into how journalism practice has changed, how the representation has changed. So yeah, there is a lot in the book. Like I say, it's based on my PhD, which was a lot longer and a lot more boring, but it is all in there as well. And that was based around year per year chapters. So yeah, I hope that answers a little bit. I'm also with you on the historical analysis. It was difficult for me to pull myself back from that a bit, because obviously I am South African and I did live through a lot of this. So it was difficult for me to sort of separate my own experiences from what I was analyzing. And actually writing the book was quite cathartic because I could put in a lot more of my emotions and my experiences, whereas with the PhD, I had to keep that separate.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting that, you know, showing the kind of backsliding and stuff that we're obviously seeing everywhere, with parties who are perhaps a bit tired and kind of out of ideas, is quite an interesting way in which thing that struck me reading it. I'm lucky enough to have been able to read some of this in preparation. Okay, I'll stop hogging. I see that Tom has a question. If you'd like to come in.
That was great, Bernadine. And the question
Thanks.
I sort of wanted to ask was, to what degree is what you've described, to what degree is it sort of uniquely South African, and to what degree is, you know, do we see this? Obviously, we see some of the same things in other countries, and not just dictatorships, but also democracies. You know, if we look in our own, you know, the moves against the likes of Channel 4, skewing of Ofcom, the BBC Trust, and so on. So what of what you're describing is, I suppose, uniquely South African, and what is part of the general corruption of politics and the determination of politicians to get a grip on the messaging and the messengers?
Great question. I wish I could answer you, but I haven't written the book yet. Because that's actually something that I want to go forward with in terms of an edited book about how mediatized elections work within the rest of the world. So it's something that I would be really interested to analyze and also compare that in terms of how South Africa has something like the liberation narrative, but then also how that works within the UK in terms of the heritage vote, and how, you know, the Tories might have state capture, might not, that sort of thing. So it's something I'm really interested in. I can't give you a direct answer now because I simply don't really know, but you can definitely see some of this in different societies. I mean, the whole idea of global political journalism, mediatization, that is a global theory. It's just whether South Africa had it, and it does have it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I suppose, was there anything specifically South African then in terms of what happened, or was it political?
Good point. I'm not sure if there's anything uniquely South African. There are a couple of instances that I think are, in terms of how the electorate are visualized. I write about it in the book called The Hands Up Frame, where specifically IFP electorate are always shown with their hands up and hands in the air. And that started from 1994, where the hands in the air was, they were holding weapons like knobkerries or shields. But then in later years, there was kind of this frame that the IFP support and the voters always had their hands up. So I don't know if that's uniquely South African. I think it probably is, in terms of how a specific electorate are shown in like a tribal way. Mm-hmm. But then I suppose you could say the same thing here in terms of, you know, working class voters, like the North. I don't know. I suppose you could see the same kind of frame. The other thing that is not probably uniquely South African is the state capture that's currently under investigation in the Zuma era, from the Guptas, from Bell Pottinger, from McKinsey and Associates. If you're interested in that, please read it. It's interesting and horrible at the same time. They've taken, I don't know, maybe 5 years to investigate all of it. And that has deep ramifications for how the media exists in South Africa.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Looks like, well, we've got a question in the room and one in the chat. The chat came first, so I don't know if Amy wants to ask herself, or I can ask for the benefit of the video. I'm happy to read it out. Okay, so I'm interested to know how you managed to keep your own emotional bias out of the work, especially with such an emotionally charged topic. And Also, I imagine there's a significant read across for other countries, and this could be one of a series. So you've got some work to do there, Bernadine.
That's okay, I don't mind. Yeah, that's a good question, actually. And to be honest, the way that I separated myself is I moved away. I actually moved into my mother-in-law's spare room in the last year of my write-up because I could not separate myself from what was happening. We had the Fees Must Fall and the Roads Must Fall movement literally right outside my office window. And at the time I was analysing the news broadcasts representing that, and it was very difficult for me to separate myself. So I literally did what nobody on earth should ever do, and that's lock yourself away in a room for 14 hours a day and just focus completely. It wasn't great for my mental health, but that was the PhD. In terms of the book, I found it much more cathartic to put the emotion back into it, and look at it from a bit of a distance as well. So yeah, no real advice there. More things, don't do what I did. In terms of the first book of the series, that would be nice. Like I say, I have something in mind in terms of the mediatised elections, but we'll see.
Lovely. I think Lerna's got a question.
Yeah, hi, nice to see you, Bernadine. It's been a long time, it feels like.
Long time.
And thanks for a great talk. I was wondering if you could say something about the role of opposition parties in this dynamic. So I know that there are very different types of opposition parties that try to capture some of these narratives themselves, and others have no chance and take a different tack. But there's also been some legal actions in terms of government censorship of the SABC, and I don't know, how's that playing out, and is there any hope that they can do something productive, or is it going to be more damaging, or what's your take on that?
Oh, that's a good question. I know that a lot of your research focuses on the EFF as well, and how they're visualized. That's a really difficult question, because in terms of opposition politics in South Africa, the ANC dominates so much, not only in terms of how citizens identify with the ANC, with this whole idea of the liberation movement, but also because they dominate parliament as well. So any policy that is voted through gets majority. So it's difficult to change anything in that way. I don't know in terms of opposition politics, how things are going to play out politically. In terms of the media in particular, I know I don't want to blow their trumpet too much because they're deeply problematic, but the DA actually was the whistleblower for the Bell Pottinger thing that happened. So the state capture, what is it called? The RET, Radical Economic Transformation, white monopoly capital, all of that kind of thing was a Bell Pottinger PR thing. I'm saying thing because I can't remember the word, but the DA actually did the whistleblowing on that with a lot of our investigative journalists. So that's kind of oppositional politics, but they're also deeply problematic. The EFF are deeply problematic. The VF Plus are now suddenly back in the running. They're also deeply problematic. So I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. I know that the media is struggling under, increased political control. That's a problem. We do have independent news media now that the Guptas have relinquished control of ANN7 and ANA. But things like Ground Up, like Amandla, like Politically Aware, like Vice News, all of these non-mainstream channels will help with the public sphere in South Africa, I think. I hope that kind of answers your question. Okay.
They're good guys, basically.
Ivor, you've had your hand up for like ages. Can we?
I was just about to say, go on, Ivor.
Hi, Bernadine. Thanks for that. Apologies, I missed the start because my previous meeting overran. And therefore you might have covered this, but I've been visiting South Africa ever since the end of apartheid, not on a partly professional basis, I confess, meeting ANC colleagues who were British based. So I've got I had a slightly rose-tinted view of what was happening. So my question is in two parts. Firstly, are we really took this real media repression, which I accept, has it intensified, did it intensify greatly under Zuma, and has it eased off under Ramaphosa? because in the sort of halcyon days, which you will recall far better than me, of Mandela and Mbeki, I had a sense of media freedom. And the second question is, there were always beacons, like throughout the apartheid years and subsequently the Rand Daily Mail stands out as a beacon of independent journalism. I don't know if it still is. So I'm asking you, are we talking about a situation that has got progressively worse, or was it bad from the off? Thanks.
Great question, or two questions. So interesting. Media repression in South Africa. Yeah, that's a good point. I know a lot about the SABC and in terms of the transformation with that, more than the press. That was my area of studying. In terms of media freedom under Mandela, that was the transformation era with the SABC. So yes, there was a big push for the SABC to be the public broadcaster. It was mirrored on the BBC. So there was a big push for that, and media freedom was quite great under Mandela, even though he still had issues with Fourth Estate, being held to account for his policies, but he was the charmer, right? So he was usually presented quite well in the media. Under Mbeki got more increasingly paranoid, especially towards the later part of his presidency. And when he was ousted, that was probably the worst part of his paranoia. So I wouldn't say that there was necessarily media freedom, but again, there was a soft censorship, that he didn't necessarily put sunshine journalism as policy. He said that there should always be an ANC spokesperson in any story about the ANC. And this is where we started to see this, the ANC could always speak back to negative stories. That started under Mbeki. So it was really around sort of, I don't know, 2002, 2004, that's when media policy started to slide downhill, I would say. When Zuma came in, obviously that's when we had state capture, you know, the soft censorship turned into actual censorship under Claudia Motsoeneng. He started banning negative news images, negative stories about the ANC were taken off the BBC. The SABC, I'm sorry, I'm doing it to myself. So I would say that it was a gradual slide towards this kind of control, and then very quickly under Zuma. Whether things are better now.
As well, improve things a bit?
It's difficult to say because Ramaphosa has had COVID-19 to deal with, right? So it's more to do with that than controlling the liberation narrative. He does say that he wants to steer the ship and course correct, and there's a new dawn of the ANC. That's what he says. But again, I deal with this quite a bit in the book. He's got to balance these two factions in the ANC. The ANC is split down the middle. You have people who are who follow Zuma, and people who follow or followed Mbeki, and there are two sides to this. And Ramaphosa stands in the middle, and he's a businessman, right? That's where he comes from. So he's got to balance these two sides of things. So even though he says, okay, we're going to course correct, and I'm going to steer the ship, and there's a new dawn, he still has to look after the Zuma side as well as, you know, the traditional ANC Freedom Charter side. So it's difficult for him. There is, in terms of the SABC, right, there is some hope that things are getting back to the public service broadcasting. During COVID-19, they started this SABC education section that was free to a lot of South Africans. And that was, you know, education and language and historical programming. So there is hope, but I'm not sure if it can counteract the liberation narrative.
And the Rand Daily Mail still? Okay,
Rand Daily Mail. What you're talking about there really is the English press, which were always anti-apartheid. Well, I say always, they were captured by, you know, mining businesses and that sort of thing, but they were pretty much anti-apartheid. They were good investigative journalists. We have a strong investigative journalist tradition in South Africa. If you look at, I'm trying to remember the name, Amabungane and Daily Maverick, it's fantastic. So that's a good side of the press. Unfortunately, state capture damaged a lot of that. The funding is not there. Funding journalism is a perpetual problem globally and in South Africa.
Thank you very much.
Okay, all right. Good question.
Thank you. I think we've got another hand up. If you want to come in.
I'm trying to get video on and it's taking a, oh, hello.
Hi,
Hello.
hi, hello.
Yeah, that was a very interesting talk, especially I'm in Botswana, so that was very close to home to hear about the historical approach. Very, very interesting. And the idea of state capture really got me intrigued, because in my own research, I'm interested in tracing protest action, strike action, and how that is represented in the media. And one of the things that came out of my PhD was the opposition politicians complaining a lot that the media, the government media, only represents the voice of the government in terms of reporting or covering the worker strikes in Botswana. So that really got, I got so interested as we were talking about the state capture. But one thing I wanted to ask, last year, during the I think it was the corruption charges when Zuma got arrested, and there were a number of protests across the country. I wonder what you made out of the main narrative that came out of the news in relation to that, and also if there might be anything coming up towards the next elections, and what do you see there, especially with Zuma's corruption charges? Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I don't think I can really answer that so much for you, because I have some assumptions and some interest in it. Other things were happening here, so I didn't follow necessarily the mainstream narrative of what the protest action was on mainstream news, but I do know that it was very coincidental that all of the looting and the protest action and KZN problems happened when Jacob Zuma was arrested a couple of days after that. So that's interesting to me. It is mentioned, I think it's in the last tranche of findings from the state capture report. I'd be more interested in what you would have to say about that, seeing as that's kind of your research area. Just in terms of media capture, this goes back to what Ivor was saying, is have things gotten better under Ramaphosa? And my instinct is that he's still trying to balance things, but that still means that the liberation narrative is still in control of the media. Mainstream media is captured by, fifth estate, PR, all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if it's getting better. And what you're speaking about in terms of the protest action, Herman Wasserman writes a lot about this in terms of listening to the ground and listening to protests, and protest voices are missing from mainstream media. So when South African mainstream media only focuses on the government, that's their policy, that's what they do. They focus top down with government at the top and the voices at the bottom, right? So I wouldn't be surprised that the protest action from last year framed the government in a good way, because that's what they do. I'd be more interested to see what non-mainstream media was representing. And this isn't, I know that we hear a lot of conspiracy theories about non-mainstream media and stuff, but I actually mean things like Ground Up, Daily Maverick, Vice News, Amandla TV, that kind of thing, Politically Aware, that kind of thing. So I'd like to see how they represent it as compared to mainstream media. That doesn't answer your question at all. It's just something I'm interested into.
Thanks, that's all right.
Okay, I don't know if that's a legacy hand that you've got up there, Ivor, or if you had another question.
No, sorry, legacy
Okay,
hand.
don't worry.
It doesn't actually show on my screen, but I will take it down immediately.
I wasn't telling you off, don't worry.
No, I'm used to it.
Any final questions? We've got about a minute, so they'll have to be brief. Okay, if nobody's got any other questions, all that's left for me is to thank Bernadine for a really fascinating talk and for everybody's questions and contributions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Emily. That was very interesting, and there were some great questions there as well. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye.